Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends and on social media, because as the government likes to say, there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation going on, and a lot of it comes from the government itself. And I have the friend of the program coming back on, Richard Salsman, professor and economist, is joining me today. Richard, how is everything?
Very well. Thanks for having me again. Good to be back, Nick.
Always happy to have you on. You bring great insights to the program. And I want to start off with a basic question. Is America a capitalist country? Because I'm constantly hearing that we're a capitalist country, but for some reason I don't see it. So maybe you could provide some insights into the question of what type of economy does America actually have in 2024?
It's what I would call a mixed economy. It's a mixture of freedom and controls, a mixture of some liberties, some still remaining rule of law and contracts and integrity. But on the other hand, a massive increase, a massive role for government in spending and taxing and regulating, in manipulating money and credit. So if you go back to basics, I would put it this way. Capitalism, and by the way, even the socialists would say this too, capitalism is private ownership and control of property. Now, they'll say the means of production, but there's not only factories, but the stuff we own. So now just consider that private ownership and control of the means of production. That doesn't mean, I don't think it means anarchy. I think it means a very limited government whose sole function is to protect rights, and it's the standard: life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. Not the right to other people's stuff, not even notice the right to happiness, the right to pursue it. In other words, they had the freedom to pursue it. Now, if you use that, and by the way, the three functions of government, if that's its job, is police, courts, and a military. And, not a military that provides national defense for 75 other countries, but for the U.S., and not a racist police force and not a Justice Department that's running roughshod, antitrust, things like that. Now, on that standard, we haven't been capitalist for about 100 years. But there's a trend, of course. But prior to 1913, prior to World War I, we were the closest we came ever to capitalism. So that 50-year period between the Civil War and World War I was almost pure capitalism. And again, not anarchy. But today, government spends and taxes probably half the GDP. We know that there's these three alphabet type agencies. There's thousands of regulatory agencies and 16 cabinet agencies and the executive branch. When we started, there were four. The four, interestingly, pertain to the legitimate functions of government: state, defense, treasury, and justice. Of course, now we have a Department of Agriculture, which doesn't produce food, a Department of Education, which does not educate, a Department of Energy, which, if anything, restricts energy production. So it's a mixed economy. And Nick, I think what's the most interesting thing about it is when things go awry, they still blame it on the capitalist element that remains. That is a very common method. So, it's almost like saying, suppose as a dietitian, I gave you a food and poison as a mix, and then you got sick. I mean, everybody knows that the element that got you sick was the poison part, not the food part, And so if you just distinguish these things and say, hey, does liberty lead to prosperity? It does. Does tyranny lead to poverty historically? It does. So when you have crises or you have, stagnating economies, you can't really attribute it to the capitalist element. But I got to tell you, it isn't easy when you have a mixed system to disentangle what's what and what the cause and effects are.
No, definitely not. And I do believe that, unfortunately, there's this willful ignorance as it surrounds liberty. When you look at most people today, they weren't properly educated on it. They'll freely turn over power to the government routinely. Right. Yeah. And if we look at a list of all the free nations that exist, America doesn't even come close to the top of the capitalist list. Is that correct?
It is. And I wrote an essay about last fall for AIER, if you go to aier.org, on the American ranking on Index of Economic Freedom. So this index has been collected, I don't know, for about 30 years now by Heritage. The US is now 27th in the world. And that is a big decline over the last, I counted really, it peaked in '08 or so. Since '08, since the financial crisis and all the interventions associated with it afterwards, we have moved down the list. So we are now only the 27th freest country in the world. The freest is Singapore. And the decline is significant. It's never declined this much in a, what is it now, 15, 16-year period. So by objective measures like that, and you can look it up, the Heritage Index Freedom, economic freedom, you can look up the measurements by which we've lost it. Some of it is rule of law, some of it is fiscal recklessness. Back to the original point, by the way, sometimes people will say we're moving in a socialist direction. Technically not true, because as you know, socialism is government owning the means of production. And remember, I said capitalism is private ownership and control. What we're moving toward is a hybrid system where the government doesn't actually nationalize industry. Notice, it doesn't actually take over industry, but by heavily subsidizing, regulating, and taxing it, it is basically telling it what to do. And even to the point, of course, we know now, well, it'll tell social media companies what to do. So that odd combination of, well, you can privately own your stuff. You know, you can technically and nominally hold title to it, but we will tell you what to do with it, you know, for the benefit of the state. I hate to say it, but that's more of what's called the fascist or corporatist model. So, so even Bernie Sanders, Barack Obama, AOC, if you ask them, they don't actually say that the government should take over and own things, but they're very much in the view the government should control things.
Yeah, and I think over the last decade or so, I mean, more than a few decades, but particularly over the last decade, I think I could actually point to the 2009 bailout of the big banks
Right.
As a turning point where we
Right.
started to see the government gives these corporations a lot of
Right.
money to bail them out. And then all of a sudden, I mean, it used to be if a corporation wanted to get involved in the community, they would build a YMCA.
Right.
But
Yeah.
now they're getting involved in social policy,
Right.
and we see almost this blurring of the lines between the corporate world and the government itself. One thing I think the audience will find interesting is the international capitalist rankings. So we're going to talk about that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Are you prepared for the unexpected? As a former emergency manager, being prepared is not a choice, it's a necessity, and that's where the Wellness Company comes in. Imagine having the peace of mind that you're equipped to handle any medical crisis, from tick bites to the latest pandemic. The Wellness Company's medical emergency kit is your lifeline, packed with essential medications like ivermectin, emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and more. This kit is your ultimate preparedness solution. The Wellness Company's team of renowned medical professionals, including Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. James Thorpe, Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. Drew Pinsky, and more. They are truth-seeking doctors, and they have designed a kit that sets the gold standard for safety and prevention. Don't wait for the next crisis to strike. Visit twc.health/PAS and use promo code PAS for an exclusive 10% discount just for being a listener of this show. Prepare today, rest easy tomorrow. Use code PAS at checkout. Welcome back, everyone. So, Richard, when it comes to the international rankings of free economies and capitalism, interestingly enough, a lot of people point to the Nordic and Scandinavian nations, you know, the democratic socialist countries that the Democrats like to say. Where do these countries fall in the international rankings? Do they have freer economies there than we do here in the United States?
They do now. So they're between, we are what, 27 or so, and 10. So they're in the low 20s, high teens. Yeah, so they're not in the socialist. To get socialist, you have to get down into the ranking of like 50, 60, 70, 80. There's only 170 countries or so. Yeah, so that alone is a myth. When Bernie Sanders and others say we need the Nordic model, Denmark, Norway, or others, in many measures, those are more capitalist than America are, but especially because America has gone the other way in the last roughly 15, 20 years or so. But yeah, so that's a real problem.
It is. And when we look at capitalism, I mean, let's be honest, that's what propelled the United States.
Yes.
It's what propelled the largest and most wealthy middle class that the world has ever seen. And it's what actually prevented the communist movement here in the United States. You know, if the middle class is living good lives, they're not going to simply throw it all away to overthrow the elite class. But we've seen that the system has changed radically.
Yep.
And where are all the Milton Friedmans of the world? I mean, you know, you speak out, you openly speak out,
Yep.
but it seems like a lot of economists actually praise government regulation. You know, the Thomas Sowells, the Milton Friedmans, it's almost like they're gone, that they're extinct almost.
Well, I wrote a book called Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? And most people think of capitalists as bankers, financiers, venture capitalists. And I mean it in the sense of advocates of capitalism. And then the person you named, and there are many others like Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, but even further back, Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, others. I would put it this way, those giants, those intellectual giants and advocates of capitalism, and I would include in that Ayn Rand. So philosophers, political philosophers, Robert Nozick, they had a more multidisciplinary approach. They knew politics as well as economics as well as moral theory. So, when Friedman wrote Capitalism and Freedom, it's the moral argument, whether you fully endorse it or not. And Ayn Rand wrote Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Mises didn't just stick to economics. I think what's happened is the fields have become so isolated, so siloed, that if you ask an economist today for their view, they're not really political economists in the sense of knowing how to speak to the interaction or intersection of politics and economics or moral theory. They're only there to talk about supply-demand curves or technical issues or elasticities of demand. All this stuff. And even in politics, the political science stuff, they will eschew talking about economics. So I'm in a program at Duke that is called the P.A.S program. It stands for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. It's a recognition that these things have to be integrated and taught together. And I think that's what's missing. If you're asking, where are the former giants of the free society, we're losing that kind of more well-rounded argument and well-rounded knowledge of all the cases for capitalism, because it isn't just an economic system, in my view. It's also a moral, political, legal system, and that's a lot to take in at once, and that's a lot. It's almost too much for people. I actually think there's also even a psychological element. I've been stressing this a lot lately. Even if, in other words, you had a good economic argument for capitalism's efficiency, even if you had a good political argument for its liberty, I think a lot of people are just psychologically uncomfortable living in a free society. So if you get to the level of, you got to have self-confidence, you got to have some self-esteem, you got to have some self-responsibility, all these kind of self things. Adam Smith said self-interest drives the market economy, but I would say also psychologically self-healthiness, if you will, drives it. And people who aren't that way, people who are scared, phobic, inclined to, be kind of infantile, even though they're big and grown up, they're going to want the welfare state. They're going to want the social safety net. In other words, they fear freedom. And that's a psychological element that's even more difficult to bring into the discussion.
And do you think that's a failure within the education system? The fact that these students have no idea about what capitalism really is. I mean, if you ask any student today, define capitalism, they couldn't define it for you. If you ask them to tell you what the difference is between liberty and freedom, they couldn't do that either.
Right.
And so they have little appreciation. At the same time, we've moved away from things like personal responsibility. We've moved away from the concept of merit. And it's all about grievances, right? I mean, just take the wealth gap, for instance. We constantly hear the Democrats and the left and even some Republicans scream about the wealth gap. But what they don't tell you is that at the same time, the wealth gap may have increased. Government regulations on these corporations, government regulations in regards to industries have increased exponentially. So the idea that more government involvement is going to fix something like that is just a complete myth, is it not?
Agreed, totally. Back to your original question of how are they taught capitalism? They're basically taught that capitalism is a system of government favors for, of, and by capitalists. So when you mention the bank bailouts, for example, you and I know that bank bailouts are improper. So not only subsidizing and bailing out businesses is improper, but also regulating and taxing them to death is improper too. So both sides, right? Helping or harming them. No, it should be just hands off. But the view that this is a system favoring this particular group, wedded with the Marxist view that this particular group exploits people. So the old Marxist view was that they exploited the laborer. The neoclassical view is that they exploit the consumer. The environmentalist view is that they exploit the planet. So through and through your point about victims and perpetrators, oppressed and oppressors and oppressed, it's latent through all the analysis. And yet, I would put it this way: capitalism, to put it positively, it is not the system of exploitation. It's not the system of favoring one group over other groups. It definitely has capital in the name, but but it's a system that is so beneficial to humanity and human betterment and human well-being. The evidence and the data are so overwhelming that relatively freer, more capitalistic countries, improve standards of living and lifespans and things like that. And it's just so, I call it the habitat for humanity, kind of somewhat jokingly. It's the best habitat for humanity ever devised. And these other alternatives, whether it's fascism or socialism or any kind of theocracy, they have been so lethal and so depressing to human betterment that it's got to be some other reason other than the practical effects that people are looking for, because the practical effects are unquestioned now, that capitalism delivers the goods and delivers the higher living standards. And it's to the point where people hate it for some fundamental, deeper reasons, I think. And it can't be because it doesn't produce the goods. Everybody knows it does, even socialists do.
It's because we haven't taught people to think critically. Instead, people just take what's told to them, they regurgitate it like a bunch of lemmings, and we could look at a number of examples where that takes place. We're going to take a quick break, but when we get back, one of those examples is China. So everyone, hang tight. We're going to talk about China when we get back from this quick break. Welcome back, everyone. So, Richard, one area where people don't think critically is when it comes to China. Now, you make a distinction when it comes to China, and I think it's important for people to know. Everyone says China's a communist country, and no, they're not necessarily a communist country. They have a communist political system, but their economy is not based on communism. It's not even based on socialism. So now, how would you classify China's economy?
That's a very good question, because notice earlier when I ranked the US, I was citing an index of economic freedom. They also do publish, various groups publish indexes of political freedom. So then the question becomes, what is the relationship between political freedom and economic freedom? And cases like China or Singapore or South Korea or Thailand, now notice Asian countries, they have something called the Asian model, where their economic freedom is quite high. China's isn't all that high, but it's higher than people think, and that's why it's prospering so much. But their political freedom is not as high. Now, how do you measure political freedom? Some of it is just whether there's more than one party, whether their elections are fair and free, that kind of thing, whether everyone can vote or not, whether there's any suppression of certain groups or not, and whether there's freedom of the press or not. Now, we would all love for there to be liberty across the board. And in fact, one of the great insights of the founding fathers was that freedom is indivisible. In other words, you can't long have one kind of freedom but not another. They tend to go together or fall together. So, but that, I think, does explain the paradox of something like China or Singapore or elsewhere, where the paradox seems like if you only focus on the politics, you think they're a tyranny. But when you realize that their economies are very free, then you see why they would get prosperity. Now, look at a case like the U.S. Suppose political freedom is high in the U.S. Everyone can vote. Suppose elections are still free and fair. And suppose they don't, violate free speech or freedom of word. Suppose all that's true. Let's just stipulate that, right? Everyone knows the economy is heavily regulated, that there's heavy taxation. So we're losing liberty there, right? I would contend, if I would just like to choose between the two, what do you do every day? Every day you participate in the economy. Whereas, every 4 years you vote, or, how many people are, owners of the New York Times. Those other civil liberties are important. But, if you're given a choice between the two, I think most people would say, please leave me free to live my life in the economic realm, because that's really what's driving my motivations, my family, my standard of living. And most people really don't want anything to do with politics. The fact that even in today's world, the turnout rate, this from political science, is something like, is it 60%?
Well, it depends on what type of elections you're talking about.
Right. So the general election, right, is something like 60. But that means, for people who don't know what this means, that means 40% of people don't vote. Now, they're either satisfied with the alternatives, I'm not sure that's true, or they don't care, or they don't know. So I think sometimes the civil liberties part, although I don't want to depreciate them, are given more credence, and we're forgetting that we're losing a lot of economic liberties.
Absolutely. And when you take away economic liberties, again, as you're alluding to, ultimately chips away at just human liberty in general. I mean, we become more dependent, more reliant on the government. And something I've noticed over the last several years is the fact that anytime something happens in society, we have this knee-jerk reaction to look to government to fix the problem.
Yes. Yeah.
But government can't fix the problem. I mean, that's obviously clear. We're debating the same issues today that have been debated for the last several decades, and the government's passed all sorts of laws in regards to that. Now, what makes the situation dangerous today, though, is we have this enormous national debt.
Yes.
Okay, $35 trillion just about. It's getting higher, $1 trillion a year that we're going to be spending on interest, which is bigger than our defense budget. And not only do we have the enormous national debt, we also have open borders. And again, I always like Milton Friedman. You can't have a welfare state and open borders. How does the country survive this? You know, there are some that seem to believe that just magically we don't have to worry about the national debt. There are others that just don't have the political courage to speak about it or take it on and challenge it. But where does this end?
Well, the history of countries that borrow too much has been grim. Either default or they're ostracizing capital markets globally. There's going to be a flight, capital flight. In the case of the U.S., it would be flight away from the dollar. Now, the one of the main things permitting the U.S. to kind of get away with this for a while is that they borrow money in the same currency they issue. So in a case like Greece, well, like when Greece borrowed too much, the problem is they weren't issuing euros. They couldn't issue the euros that they borrowed in, because they were part of the ECB. So, but that doesn't, as we know in recent history with higher inflation, the fact that you resort to money printing, to accommodate borrowing, doesn't help. It just is another way of robbing people. It takes away their purchasing power. I would put it this way. The U.S. government, its size, its scope, its power, its spending, its social safety net, all these things, is so out of control that they cannot tax people enough to pay for it. Now, what do I mean by that? Put it this way. If they taxed people right up to the amount of spending, I think there would be tax revolts. I think there would be mass fleeing of the country and or taxable, fleeing by the wealthy. And so they don't do that. And so the next thing they do is borrow. Now, that's a little more complicated to people because people don't realize what borrowing means. And borrowing is technically voluntary. You don't have to lend to the government. You don't have to buy their bonds. They get the Federal Reserve to do it. They get other banks to do it. But it's much less noticeable to people than a tax bill. And then even less noticeable is the depreciation of the currency. So that would be the third method of financing themselves. I think what's happening is the government keeps promising more and more spending. It doesn't dare tax people for what it's spending. And it's doing these other things, which is absolutely undermining the solvency of the entire country. And in terms of predicting what will happen, sometimes you can predict crises, explosions, collapses and things like that. But some of it is just as mundane as a long-term, drawn-out stagnation. Japan, for example, has experienced this. If you go to Japan or ask anybody about Japan, they talk about a lost decade. There are now 3 decades. Lost decade in the sense of they have had no economic growth for three decades. And they keep borrowing money. They have the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world. I think it's approaching 280%, 300% now. We just surpassed 100%. So this is not good. This is a government basically spending the country into insolvency, and it whether you tax, borrow, or print, it's the same burden on the economy. You don't get away with having a lesser burden just because you're not taxing. You're still extracting all those resources from the economy, and it's detrimental to an economy.
Yeah, and at the same time, it doesn't help that you have so many Americans that continue to demand more and more programs, more and more expansion of government. Yeah. And when you lack statesmanship, which we don't have statesmanship, where we have political leaders that come out there to temper the people's expectations and tell them what government can provide and what government cannot provide a defense, provide for diplomacy, provide for international trade. But, we can't just sit there and take care of every little whim of people's lives. I think it's a dangerous recipe. Now, we're going to have your book up at the P.A.S. Report, so everyone check out PASreport.com. Richard, always enjoy talking to you, and I hope to have you back soon.
Okay, thanks again. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, Visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at PAS Report.